Somewhere in a home in the United States tonight, a family is going to sit down and eat a cow. Nobody at that table will think twice about it. Nobody will pause mid-bite and feel a wave of guilt. It's just dinner. The same night in that same city, that same family would be horrified, genuinely, viscerally horrified, if someone suggested eating their dog instead. Now travel roughly 7,000 miles east. In parts of China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, that exact reaction runs in reverse. Dog has been eaten there for centuries, sometimes with the same casualness Americans reserve for chicken wings. Meanwhile, travel a little further to India, and you'll find roughly 1 billion people who would find the idea of eating a cow just as disturbing, arguably more disturbing, as an American finds the idea of eating a dog. None of these reactions are irrational. None of them are stupid. And despite how heated this topic gets online, none of them are really about biology, nutrition, or animal intelligence at all. This is the story of how the exact same animal, genetically identical, nutritionally comparable, physically no different from one country to the next, can be a beloved family member in one culture and an ordinary Tuesday dinner in another. And by the end, you'll understand why that line moves, why one country in particular is erasing it right now, in real time, and what it actually takes to unwind 2,000 years of tradition inside the span of a single generation. If you tried to draw a single clean line around the world separating countries that eat dog from countries that don't, you'd fail almost immediately. There's no continent, no religion, no climate zone, and no level of economic development that reliably predicts the answer. Dog meat has historically been consumed in parts of China, South Korea, Vietnam, and the Philippines. It has also at various points in history been eaten out of pure necessity in parts of Europe, North America, and the Arctic, during famines, sieges, and extreme survival situations, including well-documented accounts from the American Civil War and early polar expeditions, where explorers occasionally consumed sled dogs when no other food remained. Meanwhile, in most of the Western world today, and increasingly across much of Asia as well, the very idea of eating dog provokes instant, almost reflexive revulsion. This isn't a clean East versus West story either. South Korea, one of the countries most closely associated with dog meat in Western media coverage, has spent the last decade actively dismantling the practice from the inside, driven almost entirely by its own citizens rather than outside pressure. So if the dividing line isn't geography, and it isn't some universal, self-evident moral law written into human nature, what actually determines which animals end up on a dinner plate and which ones end up sleeping at the foot of someone's bed? Let's start with where this tradition actually comes from, because the history is older, messier, and more regionally specific than most people assume. In China, dog meat consumption dates back thousands of years, with archaeological evidence and ancient texts referencing it as far back as the Zhou dynasty. For long stretches of Chinese history, it was simply one more available protein source among many. Not a delicacy reserved for special occasions, not a taboo, just food, particularly in regions where cattle were considered too economically valuable alive as labor animals to be slaughtered for meat. In Vietnam, dog meat, known locally as thịt cho, became especially associated with certain regions in the north, often eaten on specific days tied to the lunar calendar, connected to folk beliefs about luck, fortune, and warding off bad energy rather than everyday nutritional necessity. It carried a somewhat ritualized, occasion-based character rather than being a daily staple. In the Philippines, dog meat has historical roots in indigenous practices in parts of Luzon, though it was formally outlawed nationwide in 1998 under the Animal Welfare Act, with continued enforcement challenges persisting in some rural and mountainous areas where older traditions have been slower to fade. And in Korea specifically, this part is important because it's frequently misunderstood. Dog meat consumption as a widespread national practice is actually more recent than most people assume. Historical records suggest some form of it existed for centuries in various regions, but researchers who study Korean food history note that its broad popularization as a mainstream, nationally recognized dish, particularly the stew known as bosintang, really gained traction after the 1960s, tied closely to post-war food scarcity and a cultural belief in its supposed stamina-boosting properties during the punishing heat of Korean summers. The point here isn't to rank any of these traditions as more or less legitimate than eating beef, pork, or chicken elsewhere. It's to demonstrate that, like almost every food tradition on Earth, this one grew directly out of specific historical, economic and environmental pressures, not out of some fixed universal moral truth about which animals are inherently edible and which aren't. Here's where the psychology gets genuinely interesting, and it's the same underlying mechanism that explains a huge number of our food taboos, not just this particular one. Researchers who study human-animal relationships point to something sometimes called the pet effect, the gradual process by which certain animals get emotionally reclassified from livestock into something closer to family. It tends to happen with animals that share a specific cluster of traits. They live in close physical proximity to humans, they respond individually and predictably to their own names. They display outward signs of affection and attachment, and, critically, many of them possess physical features that trigger what ethologists call baby schema: large, forward-facing eyes, round, soft faces, compact, rounded bodies. These happen to be the exact same features that make human infants instinctively adorable to the adult human brain. And dogs, through roughly 15,000 years of domestication and selective breeding, ended up carrying an unusually concentrated dose of them. Once an animal crosses that psychological line from livestock into companion within a given culture, eating it stops functioning as a simple dietary choice and starts registering at a gut level as something closer to a moral violation. This is precisely why chickens and pigs, despite being demonstrably intelligent, social, individually distinct animals in their own right, never made that particular jump in most Western households, while dogs very clearly did. But here's the uncomfortable symmetry hiding underneath all of this. Cows never made that jump in most Western households either, and yet in India they did centuries ago, tied deeply to religious and cultural significance within Hinduism, where cows are considered sacred, and cow slaughter is restricted or outright banned across most Indian states. An American casually eating a beef burger and an Indian who finds that act genuinely disturbing are, structurally speaking, experiencing the exact same underlying emotional mechanism a Western dog owner feels at the mention of dog meat. The species attached to the feeling changes from culture to culture. The wiring generating that feeling underneath doesn't. Nowhere illustrates how quickly this classification can shift faster or more visibly than South Korea. And what's happened there over the past decade is genuinely remarkable to watch unfold in something close to real time. For decades, dog meat, particularly in the form of basintang stew, was a normalized, if never universally popular, part of Korean food culture, especially eaten during the hottest stretch of summer, traditionally called boknal, when the dish was widely believed to boost physical stamina and endurance against the heat. But starting sometime in the 2000s, public opinion inside South Korea itself began shifting dramatically. This shift was driven by a genuine generational change, sharply rising rates of pet ownership, growing organized animal welfare activism within the country, and heightened international attention during high-profile global events, most notably the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, when South Korea's dog meat industry repeatedly became a recurring source of national embarrassment on the world stage, covered extensively by international press. The underlying numbers tell this story with striking clarity. According to a 2024 survey conducted by a Seoul-based animal welfare think tank, only about 5% of South Koreans reported having eaten dog meat within the previous year, and a striking 93% stated they had no intention of consuming it going forward. The total number of dogs bred specifically for meat had already dropped by roughly 35% in just 5 years, and this decline happened before any formal nationwide ban was ever passed into law. Then, on January 9th, 2024, South Korea's National Assembly did something close to unprecedented in the country's legislative history. It passed a law specifically banning the breeding, slaughtering, distribution, and sale of dogs for meat, with a vote of 208 in favor to 0 opposed. 0. The law formally took effect in August of 2024, but it includes a lengthy grace period, allowing dog farmers and restaurant owners until February of 2027 to shut down or fully transition their existing businesses, with government-funded compensation programs offered to help ease that transition financially. Penalties for violations discovered after the 2027 deadline include up to 3 years in prison, along with fines equivalent to roughly $23,000 for those convicted of slaughtering dogs commercially. One detail people frequently misunderstand: this law doesn't actually criminalize the individual act of eating dog meat itself. It specifically targets the supply side of the industry: the breeding, the slaughtering, the commercial selling. Lawmakers deliberately built the law around dismantling the infrastructure rather than policing personal consumption directly. What makes South Korea's case so genuinely revealing isn't just the existence of the law itself. It's the underlying timeline behind it. This wasn't a centuries-old tradition erased overnight by outside diplomatic or cultural pressure. It was a slow, steady cultural shift that had already been building momentum for well over a decade before legislation ever caught up to where public sentiment already stood, driven almost entirely by internal changes within Korean society, particularly among younger generations who increasingly grew up viewing dogs primarily as household companions rather than as a farmed food source. Now it's worth being genuinely honest about the fact that this issue has real, thoughtful defenders on the other side, and simply dismissing their position outright would be intellectually lazy. Dog meat farmers across South Korea, many of them older individuals who have operated family businesses spanning decades, have argued publicly that the ban unfairly singles out their specific livelihood while leaving the country's beef, pork, and poultry industries, which involve comparably large-scale, and in some cases far larger-scale, animal slaughter every single year, completely untouched by similar legislation. Some organized farmer associations have stated clear intentions to formally challenge the new law before South Korea's constitutional court, arguing that the legislation was pushed through largely in response to international image concerns and diplomatic embarrassment, rather than reflecting a genuine, fully formed domestic ethical consensus. There's also a broader, more academic argument raised by scholars who study food ethics and animal cognition that singling out dogs specifically for legal protection while continuing to industrially farm and slaughter billions of pigs, chickens, and cattle worldwide every single year. Animals with comparable, and in the specific case of pigs, arguably even greater measurable cognitive complexity, reflects inconsistent cultural sentiment rather than a coherent, consistently applied ethical framework. If the core underlying objection is genuinely rooted in concern over animal suffering, these critics argue that logic doesn't actually stop cleanly at whichever species line a given Western consumer happens to feel personally comfortable drawing. None of this is meant to argue definitively for or against any particular position in this debate. It's meant to illustrate that this issue isn't nearly as simple as one side is enlightened and progressive while the other is backward and outdated. It's a genuine, difficult collision between economic livelihood, animal welfare ethics, cultural tradition, and deeply inconsistent species-based moral intuitions that most people, regardless of which side of this particular issue they land on, have honestly never fully examined within themselves. While South Korea moves decisively toward a full nationwide ban, the broader picture elsewhere across Asia remains considerably more mixed and regionally fragmented. In China, dog meat consumption remains technically legal at the national level, though actual practice varies enormously from region to region, and consumption has been steadily declining in many major cities in recent years. The city of Yulin in Guangxi province holds a widely publicized annual dog meat festival timed to the summer solstice that has drawn intense international criticism and considerable domestic controversy alike, with some local officials in recent years attempting to publicly distance the city's government from the event, even as it continues to occur in some scaled-back form regardless of that pressure. In Vietnam, dog meat remains fairly widely available, particularly across the country's northern provinces, though even there attitudes are visibly shifting. Hanoi's own city government has actively encouraged residents in recent years to stop consuming dog and cat meat, citing both animal welfare concerns and legitimate public health risks tied to unregulated slaughter, transport, and handling practices within the informal trade. In the Philippines, the practice remains formally illegal nationwide under the 1998 Animal Welfare Act, but it persists in isolated rural pockets and is generally treated today as an ongoing law enforcement and gradual cultural transition issue rather than an openly, publicly defended national tradition. What's particularly notable across nearly every one of these countries is the consistent direction of the underlying trend line. Almost nowhere in the region is dog meat consumption meaningfully growing. It is, with remarkable consistency, shrinking year over year, driven by rising household incomes, sharply increasing rates of pet ownership, generational cultural change, and growing everyday exposure to global animal welfare norms through international media, social platforms, and increased travel. So what actually moves this line in either direction? Looking closely at South Korea's example and comparing it against similar cultural shifts historically elsewhere, a handful of consistent underlying factors show up again and again. The first is pet ownership itself. As disposable income rises within a society, rates of pet ownership tend to rise right alongside it. And once a meaningful percentage of a country's population personally owns dogs as companions, the psychological distance between my own dog at home and a dog served on a plate tends to collapse remarkably fast, even among people who have no direct personal connection to the meat industry whatsoever. The second major factor is generational turnover. Cultural food taboos rarely shift because people already deeply embedded in an existing tradition get personally argued out of it through debate. They shift because an entirely new generation grows up with different default cultural assumptions from birth, and the older practice simply fails to get passed down with the same intensity, urgency, or emotional weight it once carried. The third factor is international visibility. Practices that were once regional, low profile, and largely private tend to become globally scrutinized the moment a country hosts a major international event, goes viral across global social media platforms, or becomes a recurring talking point in international trade negotiations and diplomacy. And that external scrutiny tends to sharply accelerate domestic pressure that may already have been quietly building beneath the surface. And the fourth, frequently underestimated factor is straightforward economic viability. In South Korea specifically, dog meat consumption had already been declining for purely commercial reasons. Younger consumers simply weren't buying the product in meaningful numbers anymore, well before the formal legal ban ever arrived. In many meaningful ways, the eventual law simply formalized into legislation a cultural and economic shift that had already substantially happened on its own, rather than single-handedly causing that shift from scratch. Here's the part of this whole story that's genuinely difficult to sit with honestly, regardless of which side of any of these debates you personally land on. If you find yourself instinctively horrified by the idea of eating dog, it's worth asking sincerely, is that horror actually grounded in some clear, consistent ethical principle about animal suffering and cognitive capacity in general? Or is it grounded simply in the fact that dogs happen to be the one species your particular culture decided, somewhat arbitrarily, to classify as families somewhere along the way? Pigs are widely considered by animal behavior researchers to be at least as intelligent as dogs, fully capable of complex problem solving, rich emotional responses, and even measurable forms of self-recognition in controlled studies. Nearly no one across most of the Western world feels comparable moral discomfort while eating bacon on a Saturday morning. Cows form genuine social bonds within their herds, reliably recognize individual human handlers over time, and display measurable physiological stress responses when separated from other members of their herd. And yet beef remains one of the single most casually, routinely consumed meats on the planet across most of the world. This isn't an argument that any particular individual food choice is inherently right or wrong. It's simply a clear demonstration that almost none of us actually arrived at our personal food taboos through pure, internally consistent ethical reasoning in the first place. We arrived at them primarily through culture, historical accident, physical proximity, and emotional attachment. And only afterward did most of us quietly backfill some kind of ethical justification to explain the feeling, almost always without ever consciously noticing we'd done exactly that. So why is dog eaten in some countries and not in others? It isn't because of biology, it isn't because of nutrition or protein content, it certainly isn't because dog meat is somehow more or less acceptable, chemically or morally, than any other meat humans have consumed at some point across recorded history. It comes down almost entirely to which specific animals a given culture happened to pull emotionally close enough, early enough in its history, and for long enough that eating them eventually stopped feeling like an ordinary meal and started feeling instead like a genuine betrayal. In South Korea, that emotional line has been actively moving in something close to real time over the past decade, ultimately culminating in a sweeping law that would have been genuinely unthinkable a single generation earlier. In other parts of Asia, that same underlying shift is happening more gradually, generation by generation, plate by plate, household by household. And if you look closely enough at your own dinner plate tonight, you might notice that exact same arbitrary, deeply human emotional logic sitting right there in front of you, just quietly applied to a completely different animal, one you personally never had any particular reason to think twice about. If this changed how you think about where the invisible line between pet and protein actually comes from, subscribe. Because there's a lot more hiding underneath the everyday food choices we almost never stop to question.